Does our world primarily run on divine compassion or divine strictness? Watch how Rashi so deftly illustrates to us that the core of existence is rachamim. In Pasuk, the Pasuk in this week's Parsha, which says, "Vayizker lekim as Noach v'eskol hachayim gomer," that the Eibishter remembered Noach and all of the animals. Rashi takes those words, Vayizker Elokim, on his Mepharish, explains, Zeh Hashem midasadin. Normally, Elokim is a name of strictness and judgment, but here, here it was transformed into a quality of compassion. And how? Through the davening of tzaddikim, obviously most notably Noach. And then, while he's about, he also points out to us, when bad people behave really badly, they can do the reverse. They can convert Hashem's characteristic of compassion into strict judgment. How do we know that? Because look in last week's parasha. The Eibishter saw that human bad behavior had increased. And the Eibishter said, I'm going to dissolve the human race. Now that Hashem is usually a name reserved for compassion, and here it's associated with destruction. So now in a pasuk, now that pasuk that we've just quoted, that Rashi tells us, where the Eibishter says he's going to destroy the world, obviously you have the same question there that you have here. How come we're using a name of compassion when you're talking about an outcome that is destructive? The same question as we have here, that the quality being described does not match the name that is being used. When it's speaking about dissolving the whole human race, which is an expression of very strict judgment, the name that is used is Havaya, the name of Rachamim. Whereas over here, when it's remembering Noach in a positive light, which is obviously compassion, Elikim, Shemi Desadin, there it uses the name Elikim Desadin. So the question is, and for deswegen, Rashi doesn't mention anything about this anomaly when we come across it in Parshas Bereshis. So in which case we have to understand. Why does Rashi only address this in a later pasuk, the pasuk in our parsha? Why didn't he address the anomaly of a characteristic that doesn't match the name the very first time that it happens in Parshas Bereshis? Not only that, furthermore, when Rashi does raise it here, when he's speaking about why Elikim is when the Eibishter is remembering Noach, now Rashi addresses what came up earlier in Parshas Bereshis. As Midas Rachamim is in Safek Yivorin and Midas Adin, that David's compassion was transformed into strict justice. So in other words, Rashi does want to address it. So then why didn't he address it when it came up originally? That proves as dort al asar is in Token Hechach for Pasuk Eftim Pirish. If Rashi has to explain it, that means when we learned those psukim in Parshas Bereshis, there wasn't an obvious explanation for why the name Hashem is being used. On Dafke from Pasuk Vayizker Lekim is da starke Eichachali Firushai, and there's nothing apparently in Parshas Bereshis that proves Rashi's point that you have the power of transforming positive to negative, negative to positive, until you come to our parasha. Now there's such a compelling reason that Vayizker could turn Elokim into something of Rachamim, as Midas Adin Efchel Midas Rachamim, because das is Bol Elamed Eichef the Friedeke Psukim Vayargam Vayomer. So what is so compelling about the explanation of Vayizker Elokim as Noach that is so strong? Not only will it explain why Elokim is used in the case of remembering Noach, but it will also explain why Havaya is used in the case of destroying humanity. And will illustrate to us that over there too, the Eibishter's characteristic of Din was turned, of Rachamim was turned into Din. Why is that? So mechanic Denfren don't suggest that we should answer as bees and Pasuk Vayizker Elokim Veismanit in Derech Hapshat Hashem Havayis Midas Rachamim and Shem Elokim is Midas Adin. The worst answer to suggest would be that up until this point we don't know that Elokim is usually the name of Din and Havaya is normally the name of Rachamim. Obviously, it's mashma lecheira from Lashon Rashi, which you might have actually said is what Rashi is telling us when he says Zeh Hashem Midas Adin Hu. First, he tells us this name Elokim is a name of justice, and then V'hu Shem Midas Rachamim. When he talks about the parasha in Bereshis, he tells us that Havaya is Midas Rachamim. A signal shel chiddush was Rashi learned arose from the pasuk, and you might suggest that Rashi is telling us new information we would not have known. You cannot say that. Because first of all, you'd have to ask, well, why here is it suddenly so clear that Elokim is Midas Adin? From Pasuk Vayizker Elokim, haben a idea in Inyan Hashem is mehr von the Friedeke Psukim Vayar Hashem Goyim Vayom Hashem Goyim. What is it in the pasuk Vayizkor Elokim that makes it more clear to us that Elokim is the name of Din, more than in the pasuk Vayom Hashem Emche, that we would know there that the name is Midas Rachamim. But besides that is Oid Ve'iker. The main reason why you can't suggest this is because because we see right at the beginning of the Torah, if Beresh is Bara Elokim, when it says that Elokim created the world, Rashi immediately explained to us the relevance of the characteristic associated with Elokim. Because Rashi tells us, it doesn't say that the Eibishter in his Midas Rachamim created the world. Why not? But the reason is because the Eibishter said Elokim, because initially he wanted to build a world that is run on strict judgment, and he saw that that's unsustainable. Therefore, the Eibishter preceded Midas Rachamim to even go before Midas Adin. And how do we know that? That when it came to the time of actually creating the world, it first puts the name Havaya and then the name Elokim. So we already know that Havaya is the name of Rachamim and Elokim is the name of Din. That's not what Rashi is telling us over here. So back to square one, why didn't Rashi address the issue of the anomaly of the name mismatching the characteristic when it first happens in Bereshis? And what's so compelling in Vayizkor Elokim that he can use that to explain both psukim? So to understand that, let's go back to what Rashi said about Bereshis and the specific wording that he used. Look at the wording that Rashi chose when he spoke about why Elokim is the name of creation. He saw that the world cannot sustain if it is a world of din. Therefore, he first initially preceded the element of Rachamim and coupled it together with Midas Adin. Now, from the Lashon Rashi, the fact that Rashi says Vehiktim Midas Rachamim, that he then preceded Midas Rachamim before Midas Adin, even though the original plan was Midas Adin, is Muchach. That proves as the Eibishter hat nit nur mishatev Midas Rachamim and Midas Adin, that the Eibishter did not only partner Rachamim with Din to mitigate the effects of the Din, as the Anogas Elam soll sein from beide Midas in a gleiche Status, which would have implied that the world runs with a balance between Midas Adin and Midas Rachamim. No, hat Midas Rachamim gegeben akadim legabe Midas Adin, but Rashi specifies that the Eibishter precedes, in other words, gives priority to Midas Rachamim over Midas Adin. Wie das said in Pasuk Yema says Havaya und noch Elokim goyim, as the Pasuk says that the world was created by Havaya and only after Elokim. And das meant as Midas Rachamim is the Iker. So that's telling us, as Rashi points out, that the core of how the world is going to operate is with Midas Rachamim. Das heißt, B'shas die Welt ist in einer Matze, was es weckt sich, zieht der Anoga soll sein mit Midas Rachamim oder mit Midas Adin, which means practically, if the world is now hanging in the balance, and there's a decision to be made, should the world now be run according to compassion or according to Din, is Midas Rachamim kidemus v'meila machria. The Midas Rachamim is going to take priority and precedence, and that's going to determine the way in which the Eibishter is going to run his world, which is going to be with Midas Rachamim. That's an important principle for us to understand. Al Kopolim is moving. As alt was tut sich in Welt, muss sein et achron psak von Midas Rachamim. So what that clarifies for us is that whatever's going to happen in the world has to be, so to speak, determined by and accepted by Midas Rachamim. Eich die Oinshim de la Meile can nicht sein on the Auskommen von Midas Rachamim, which means that even if there's going to be some element of punishment in the world, it has to be ratified by Midas Rachamim. Which is interesting. Because if there were the possibility of something happening in the world which is only strict judgment without the input of Rachamim, then it's an unsustainable world, which is, of course, what the Eibishter was pointing out right from the beginning. We cannot live in a world where things are so strict. So Midas Adin, so even Midas Adin, where the Eibishter is going to judge and is going to punish, that has to be in partnership with Midas Rachamim. One of the Baldas the Mator from Bria Solim is Virashi's Meforish Bishvil HaTorah. Why is this? Because Rashi tells us the purpose of the world was Beis Reishis for the sake of Torah. Was maybe Pashtus as nit naras is Doa Torah. That doesn't just mean that the purpose of the world was that there should be a Torah, but much more importantly, as Yidden B'Shvil Yisrael, that there should be Yidden who sollen learn Torah, who will learn that Torah, or Mekayim Zanir mitzvahs and fulfill the mitzvahs. Now, if you want to have the Yidden following the Torah and mitzvahs, then there has to be a system of reward and punishment. Otherwise, how is there some kind of responsibility for our, or consequence for our responsibility to following the Torah? So muss doch sein adin scharvenish zu versichern as in lernen Torah. There has to be din and there has to be reward and punishment to ensure that we actually keep the Torah. Was das geht Welt is chosakim, because it's only if we keep in the Torah properly that's what gives the world the right to exist. Aber von deswegen der Olam soll haben akim. Yet in spite of the absolute need for din, in order to have checks and balances, still, if the world is going to sustain, there has to be an element of compassion. Not only should there be compassion, but that's going to be the overwhelming input into how the world exists. Okay, so now that we know this principle, that the core driver of how the world exists is on the basis of rachamim, Rashi stellt sich nicht auf dem, was der Pasuk sagt in Bereshit, when the Torah tells us that there's going to be a punishment, but the name is Hashem, doesn't raise Rashi's eyebrows. Only Elikim, even though the word Elikim, which is a word of din, is not used over there. That's fine, that makes sense. Because the system that the Eibishter created is that Rachamim takes precedence over din. Which means that even punishments like here, the destruction of humanity, cannot happen without the approval of Midas Rachamim. So therefore it makes sense that the Torah will use the word Midas Rachamim, the name Havaya, even when it's talking about punishment. That makes sense because punishment will be mitigated by Rachamim. That is the system that they chose. Because had the expression been that Elikim is going to destroy humanity, then we're going to have a major question. Wie kann sein, als mitzad mitzadin elikim allein soll sein die Achloten an Augen von Emche? How is it possible that the Eibishter would allow a decision about destruction of humanity to rest completely in the hands and the decision of Shem Elikim? Wo ist der Hiktim midas Rachamim v'shittel midas adin? Where is the core principle that the Eibishter precedes and prioritizes Rachamim over din? We don't see that in this particular story. So therefore it's obvious to Rashi that Vayomer Hashem Emche is the appropriate way to do things. Therefore, the Torah tells us that yes, it would be midas hadin, the shem elikim, that would actually mete out the punishment of the Mabul. Is Vayomer Hashem Emche, but the decision to do so, the decision to allow such devastation had to come through and be ratified by Shem Havaya, by Midas Rachamim, because that's how the world works. So at that point, we're not surprised that Havaya is a name associated even with din. Even though, again, the practical application of this punishment goes through the channel of Midas Hadin represented by the name Elikim. So how does the Torah say Hashem says Emche? Well, we'll say, well, it's an abbreviated version of the pasuk. Rashi's already told us that there are abbreviated psukim. It does exist. So we should read this pasuk as if it had said, that Hashem gave the authority, Hashem meaning Midas Harachamim, gave the authority or agreed to Midas Hadin, represented by the Kim, actually destroying humanity. Okay, it's not the simplest way to read that pasuk, understandably. Aber das Salz glatte wird zum Vorsein, als Vayom Hashem Echem meint, as a tim befeil is gekommen von Midas Rachamim Hashem, but it is easier to accept that the pasuk is abbreviated than to accept the possibility that Midas Rachamim actually wants, God forbid, to cause devastation. But it's in Ganzen, in Mistabo, Befraten der Pshat, because it's certainly not logical and definitely not in the realm of Pshat, as Ben Adam, that we believe that human beings could behave so badly. Okay, so to believe that humans through their davening can change Hashem's characteristic, maybe you could accept it. But here we're talking about humans through their actions, behaving in such a way that's going to turn Midas Harachamim into Midas Adin. That is a very difficult concept to get our heads around. So it makes much more sense to say that Midas Harachamim over here agreed to what was going to happen, rather than Midas Harachamim became the punisher. It definitely makes sense to us that a person through their davening, through tshuva, etc., can activate or arouse Hashem's mercy. That makes sense to us. We can even understand that if a person behaves really badly, it could be such a misdemeanor that even Midas Harachamim agrees that there has to be a punishment. But that punishment will be meted out through the Midas Hadin. But das legt sich aber nicht zu sagen, what is not logical is to suggest, as Midas Harachamim gufas soll nisafech werden und durch ben Adam. It does not make sense to believe that Hashem's Midas Harachamim will no longer be Rachamim, it will become din, and the reason it should do so is because of behaviors, the human behavior. bis hereinlegen sich zu durchwinden to the extent that Midas Harachamim is actually going to be the punisher. Therefore, it's easier for us to suggest that the pasuk is abbreviated than to believe that Midas Harachamim actually became Midas Adin. Now, the Pirush of Vayom Hashem Emcha Beifen Zeh, so if we're going to see that pasuk in this light, as the Midas Harachamim what maskim given us as Dav Zayin Emcha, which means that Midas Harachamim acknowledge that there has to be some kind of a punishment because of the behavior of humans. That would make sense, because we're dealing with Midas Harachamim, and we already have a principle, was hiktim Midas Harachamim, that the priority is Midas Harachamim. This is the ikum machria in al inyonim von anogas olam kanal, and Midas Harachamim has to weigh in, and is in fact the key component to determining how anything that happens in the world is going to happen. That makes sense. And therefore it makes sense that we can even say when something strict is happening in the world, it is still associated with Midas Harachamim, who had to weigh in and give a view and authorize that Midas Adin to be meted out, obviously through Shem Elekim. Now, however, when you come to this pasuk that the Elekim remembers Noach, where we're talking about an action which is a compassionate action, to remember Noach and allow them all to survive and get out of the teva and repopulate the world. So in that case, it's a big question. How does it make sense over here to say that who's remembering Noach? Midas Adin. But why Midas Adin? Midas Harachamim is the key influencer of all things in life, certainly something which is outright compassion itself. Therefore, Rashi has to address it. Even if you want to suggest that something special happened over here, that what happened over here is not only was the Midas Harachamim successful in overriding the Midas Adin, but maybe more than that the Midas Adin, who wanted, so to speak, possibly more punishment or more difficulty or more challenge, agreed to the Midas Harachamim that we should allow them now to come out and to repopulate the earth. Maybe along the same lines of what we said about the Midas Harachamim being masking to the Midas Adin when Hashem says He's going to destroy the people in the first place. Even if that's true, it still doesn't make sense to say that Elokim is the one who remembered Noach. It does not make sense to associate the remembering of Noach and the animals, Noach and his family and the animals, dafka to the word Elokim. Therefore, Rashi has to explain it, and the way that it explains it is it says we're now going to discover something brand new that we did not know possible before, even in the pasuk of Vayom Hashem Emcha, something spectacular happened over here. Not only did Midas Harachamim remember Noach, but even Midas Hadin remembered Noach in a positive light. Not only was there a remembering of Noach by Midas Harachamim to which Midas Hadin was willing to accede, but something spectacular happened over here, that the Midas Hadin actually became compassionate. That's something unexpected. That's something we hadn't known was even a possibility. Now we've introduced a new insight, which is that humans, through our choices, as Rashi says, through the Tefillah of Tzadikim, are able not only to impact that the Midas Hadin would defer to the Midas Harachamim, but the Midas Hadin can actually change and become Rachamim. Is mistaver as the pasuk Vayom Hashem Emcha. Now we look back at the pasuk Vayom Hashem Emcha and we say, hang on a second, maybe it doesn't just simply mean that the Midas Harachamim agreed to the Midas Adin in terms of what should happen. It's nikim mikra kotzen. It's not just an abbreviated pasuk. Not the Emcha is gikumen von Hashem Midas Harachamim atzmai. But maybe something dramatic happened over here that even Midas Harachamim was ready to devastate humanity. Now Rashi says, well, in the same way as human behavior and davening, etc., can transform Midas Adin to become Midas Harachamim, the negative behavior can transform Midas Harachamim to become Midas Adin. That's what Rashi is now alerting us to, which we would never have known in the pasuk in Bereshis on its own. Now, but we really have to understand this. In this case of Noach in the Teva, why do we have to have the special davening of the tzaddikim in order to transform the Midas Adin to Midas Harachamim? Der Vayisker soll sein von Elokim. Und es ist nicht genug, der Vayisker bloß von Shem Havaya. Who needs the Midas Adin to transform? All we need is Midas Harachamim. We need the Eibishter to have Rachamim on Noach and everybody who's in the Teva, and that's good enough. Why is it necessary to transform the Midas Adin itself? Says the Bir in them. So the explanation is you have to understand the context. This Vayiskor is leading up to one of the most important moments in human history. The Indian from Vayizger Gomes Noach Gomer is given der Scholle von der Christus Bris. Was der Eibishter hat noch gemacht mit Noachen. Remembering Noach is the first step towards what was going to become an eternal covenant between the Eibishter and Noach, which is effectively and all of humanity. What's the covenant? As well, it's there never will be again a devastating flood like this that will destroy humanity. In other words, the Eibishter is negating the possibility of such a dramatic experience ever again in the future. If you want to ensure that there'll never be such a devastating cataclysmic event, then it's not good enough just to say that Midas HaRachamim is going to protect the humanity. Midas Hadin soll nur nicht menaged sein oder dafür maskim sein. And then to ensure, well, at this week, I promise you that Midas Hadin will never get in the way, or will always acknowledge that we have to have this Rachamim. But then, well, what kind of a covenant are you making with humanity if the Midas Hadin, which is a component of how the Eibishter runs the world, still entertains the possibility that perhaps everybody does deserve to be destroyed? The Eibishter's covenant has to be based on the fact that there is absolutely no possibility, even in theory, of the destruction of the whole world again. Therefore, he had to specifically say that Elikim has to now generate the compassion. As Midas Hadin Gufa is Nesapach Givorn Midas Harachamim, that what was previously Midas Hadin and willing to destroy all of everything has to now become Midas Harachamim. And then we can be absolutely guaranteed that no absolutely devastating event will ever happen again in history. So that's the context of how Rashi puts together, firstly teaching us that the basis of all existence is Midas HaRachamim, and the guarantee of the survival of humanity is that the Midas Hadin is converted to Midas HaRachamim in the sense that there's no scope for even the thought of destroying humanity completely. We're now going to look at this all from the perspective of Chassidus and link it into the davening that we do on Rosh Hashanah. The pasuk Vayizkar Kimas Noach v'Gomer v'et gesagt in Musaf Rosh Hashanah. We know that this pasuk Vayizkar Kimas Noach is quoted in the Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. Alseina und der erste von die Psuke Zichronis, as one of, in fact, it's one of the first quotations that we have in the section called Zichronis. In which case, it's nicht verstandig. That's strange. The Teichen von alle Psuke Zichronis is wegen dem Zikaron von. What is Zichronis all about? It's about the Eibishter remembering. Or der Bris, was der Eibishter gemacht mit Eden, remembering the Yidden and the covenant and promise that the Eibishter made with Yidden. Even though in our davening we say that you, the Eibishter, you remember the entire world and you remember all of those you've created in the world. But we do know that the primary focus of Rosh Hashanah is the Eibishter remembering the Yidden. Of course, we're going to then accept the Eibishter as our king, etc. Durch dem Zikaron von Neshamas Yisrael wird aufgetan der Zikaron von Kol Yitzurei Kedem. And when the Eibishter remembers us in a positive light, that has a positive impact on the way that the Eibishter remembers all of existence. But the primary focus is the Zikaron of Yid. If that's the case, so then why do we quote this pasuk? Was der Zikaron is jetzt im closing Gimo Olam noch a Mabel. That's not a pasuk about remembering the Jewish people, the special relationship that Hashem has with us. This is a pasuk about remembering all of existence, that it should never be destroyed again. So steht then der Bier, sein Chassidus, we explain this, as the Zikaron was is given Father Christus Bris. When the Eibishter remembers Noach before making the covenant that will protect humanity for all of existence, is given it's not that the Eibishter remembered Noach because he wanted to sustain the world, but rather he remembered Noach and the greatness of Noach, which is that out of Noach would come those people who would have neshamas, and that's what the Eibishter remembers, which in turn guarantees the survival of existence. That's why we say, not only did you remember Noach, but specifically with love, which is referencing the deep, essential love that the Eibishter has for our neshamas, which was sufficient to remember Noach in a way that he should be protected and he should survive, and by extension the world should sustain. But we still have to understand, because straight after the words where we say that you, the Eibishter, remembered Noach with tremendous love, we continue the tefillah and we say that you remembered him in a way of salvation, in a way of compassion at the time of the Mabel, and therefore the memory of him comes before you. Was das meint, as a Zikaron is Kidei soll sein die Krisis Bris of Kim Oilam, which sounds like what we're saying is that the Eibishter remembered Noach in order to make a covenant to sustain the world, which again does not seem to be something specifically about us. Is das Bora Bezeh, so the deep explanation. The Krisis Bris mit Noach and Kim Oilam is nicht stam auf Versicherung as die Welt wird haben Akim. The covenant that the Eibishter makes with Noach about the world is not only that the world should be sustainable, and not only a guarantee that there'd never be absolute destruction again. Now, as the Elam soll sein behesem zu der Kavanah v'tachlis briyosa, but the Eibishter's Krisis Bris is that the kind of world that will sustain is the kind of world that suits the intention of why the Eibishter created the world. And why did the Eibishter create the world? For the Yidden is moving, as the Krisis Bris is verbunden mit Zikaron shekadma ve'hevi al Noach mitzad atzmai mitzad etzem meiles neshamas Yisrael. Therefore, what the Eibishter is remembering over here is neshamas Yisrael, who will emerge from Noach's descendants, who in turn will fulfill the purpose for which the world was created, which is why the Eibishter is guaranteeing the sustainability of the world so that it could achieve his goals. So der Inyan, as the Krisis Bris mit Noach Kim Oilam is as the Eilam soll sein matim zu Kavanas Habriya. So this is very important for us now. We understand that the covenant that the Eibishter made with Noach was that there should be a world which is suited to the Eibishter's intentions and goal for the world. Spitzechab in them ufdu from the Krisis Bris, as in Anhagas Eilam soll nicht sein, kin shine v'hefsek. So you see that part of the covenant that the Eibishter made with the world is that the cycles and seasons of the world will continue without interruption. That there's going to be the seasons of harvest and the winters, etc., and they're never going to cease. The fact that nature proceeds without change, that illustrates that invested in nature is an infinite power. That's why things don't stop, because they've got an infinite element to them. Power that comes from the Eibishter's Ein Sof. Because if you look at Teva, at nature, in and of itself, like anything that is created, it's impossible for anything which is natural or for anything which had been created, it's impossible that it doesn't at some point end or cease or pause. It can't be. The only reason that things perpetuate in a never-ending cycle is because invested in them is the Eibishter's infinite power, because the Eibishter never changes, therefore these systems never change. Kommt aus, als hat der Teuker verchösert, was sei reingegeben geworden in der Metzius so einem durch die Krisis Bris. So therefore, the sustainability of the world, not only in the long term, but even in its systems and seasons, which is part of what the Eibishter guarantees to Noach in the covenant that he makes, is nicht ein von Hellen und Hesten, verkehrt ein von Ginlei Kayach in Seif Shalamayim Megeder Shinoi. So even though we're talking here about the world, and the world is a reality that typically hides and conceals Hashem, the Eibishter's Krisis Bris is not to say we will perpetuate a world of distorting and concealing godliness. To the contrary, we're going to perpetuate a world and a creation of revealing godliness, and specifically revealing infinite godliness. That will also help us understand the pasuk that says when the Eibishter so-called smelled the beautiful smell of the korban that Noach brought after he came out of the Teva, was das hat gefällt to Krisis Bris mit Noach, which was the catalyst for the covenant that Hashem made with Noach. So it says that the Eibishter says, I will not continue to curse the land because of human beings. As a reach nechoyach is merames, so the Medrash says, what is this reach nechoyach? Is merames afreicha shel Avram Avinu oila mekiv shanoish. So the Medrash says it's not the smell of that korban, rather it's the smell of the smoke of the furnace in which Avram Avinu was thrown. And then it continues, reach shechanani mishal v'azariah oila mekiv shanoish, as well as the smell of the smoke of the furnace where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown, because they also refused to serve Avodah Zarah. And then continues, and it is the smell of the commitment of Jewish people in those generations where we were forced to either give up our lives or our religion. Das heißt, in other words, as im Messias Nefesh von Avram Avinu, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Derish Shmad, or the Aris Girufim Demayim Hashem Loisif Lekal Gomer, that what was the catalyst for the Eibishter saying, I will not curse the world ever again, and there's this guarantee and a covenant that the world is going to sustain, is not just the korban that Noach brought, but the Messias Nefesh that would occur throughout the generations, from Avram Avinu all the way to those who stood up for their Judaism. Fragt man auf dem, so Chassidus asks the question, was ist der Reach Nichach von Noach's Karbonas allein nicht genug zu auftan the Christus Bris of Kiyama Olam? How come the Karbonas that Noach brought were not sufficient to achieve this covenant for all time? Und so hat sich gefolgt, Dafke der Reach von dem Messias Nefesh. But you Dafke had to reach a point of having this whiff, so to speak, of Messias Nefesh. Bis the Messias Nefesh, Madarish Shmad, was is the Darga Ochinalis and Avedis Hashem. And extreme Messias Nefesh of these generations of people who were threatened with their religion, which is the highest level of dedication to Hashem. Why is the highest level of dedication required in order to guarantee that the world will never be destroyed again? So the beer in them, the explanation is, as we've pointed out, the purpose of this covenant was to ensure not only that the world will exist, but that it will exist in such a way that it doesn't ever cease. Which means two things. That David has now inserted into the world his infinite power, which never changes, and therefore the realities of the world also never change. And where will you see this evidence and this expression of absolute divine infinite power? Where will you see it? In nature, which is quite surprising. So if we're introducing something which is completely infinite into a reality that is the reality of nature, in order to introduce it, we have to be doing something in our dedication to Hashem which is aligned with what we're achieving, because that's always the case. That's the avodah from Mesiras Nefesh. So what is aligned with Koyach Ein Sof? Serving the Eibishter with absolute sacrifice. Befrat, the Mesiras Nefesh, Madarish Shmad, was Mesiras Nefesh, hat in sich zwei Jahren, particularly Mesiras Nefesh at a time where there's a threat to our Jewish identity. And Mesiras Nefesh expresses itself in two ways. Mesiras Nefesh weiß, as David also open from Leishanisi. First of all, Mesiras Nefesh means that the person does not waver in their dedication to Hashem. Their dedication doesn't change. Kein Zach. Nothing can interfere with a person's dedication to Hashem, even the greatest difficulties or concealments. Not only does it not stop our avodah, it doesn't even weaken our avodah. So we have Lo Shonisi in our avodah, therefore that stimulates Lo Shonisi of the Eibishter's power into the world. Leidach, on the other hand, the irony of Mesiras Nefesh is what is it that draws out the greatest Mesiras Nefesh, the greatest darkness? As a Kech Mesiras Nefesh is Meir in Zman HaGolus, Meir B'Zman HaBayis, as we well know, Mesiras Nefesh is much more prevalent in Golus than it would have been in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. It's because that darkness and challenge of Golus, that is actually what stimulates this dedication of Mesiras Nefesh. Kommt euch, as the Henem Behester Gufa, was Bechitzenis is Meneo Makev Avedas Hashem, that illustrates that it is Dafka, those impediments that block and interfere with our service of Hashem. Ironically, as that's actually what brings out the greatest strength in our commitment to Hashem. To the extent of Mesiras Nefesh, which is beyond any kind of a limitation. When a Jew does this and overcomes all of those impediments and all of those challenges and serves the Eibishter with absolute Mesiras Nefesh, is der mit Gufem erwartet dem hellen Behester, und es werden es Gale als die Kabonen von den Nisoim bei hellen Behester ist gewähnt. So when a person is so dedicated to doing what Hashem wants, despite all of the challenges that are flying in their face, that in turn neutralizes those challenges and actually illustrates that they were only there as catalysts for the person to be able to serve Hashem without any limits at all. Und das der Bier, was der Vayisker hat gebracht, die Christus Bris, was hat gebracht die Christus Bris, hat gemusst sein von Elikim. And that gives us a deeper explanation as to why the Vayisker, which is going to bring to the covenant that Eibishter makes with us, is what kind of it's Vayisker Elikim, which you wouldn't have expected to be the source of such incredible goodness in the world and for the world. Midas Adin Atzmod Gedaf Nefech Beren to Midas Rachmim, where we're seeing that the Midas Adin itself is transformed into a Midas Rachmim, something you don't expect. Because their Inyan as Teva Gufos or bringing Segilolikus, the same concept that the nature of the world, which is often the interference with our serving the Eibishter, becomes the catalyst for tremendous dedication to Hashem. The only way that can happen is if you have Shem Elikim, the Mokarev Teva, which is the spiritual source of all natural systems and realities. and therefore Elikim is the reason why there's darkness and obstruction in the world. That has to be transformed into Rachamim, which is all about revealing godliness in the world. When Elikim becomes a catalyst for revealing godliness in the world, that creates the possibility that our challenges could draw or could stimulate within us Mesiras Nefesh, which brings more Gilui Elikus in the world. So what is the primary cause that the Eibishter will transform Midas Hadin to Midas Harachamim? Is the fact that the Eibishter remembers Noach with love. There's a current from the Abba Pnimis V'Atzmas from the Eibishter to Idem Mitzad Etzem Mailis Nishamas Yisrael, where the Eibishter, so to speak, remembers this deep core love for the Jewish people because of our tremendous value. Because we are rooted in the Eibishter's essence, which is way beyond and not limited to any of the midas, be they din or rachamim. And when you're at that elevated level, then you have the power to transform even midas adin to become midas rachamim. So by virtue of the fact that our neshamas are so deeply linked to the Eibishter's essence, and therefore the love that the Eibishter has for us is a love at his essence that empowers the possibility for transforming Midas Adin into Midas Rachamim, which in turn allows us the opportunity to take all the challenges in the world to become stronger and more committed because of it and reveal more godliness because of it. And das kommt herab lemata mata, bis wird bottle alla lomes verstehen finden on Yiddishkeit, and that translates into a reality where all of the obstacles to Yiddishkeit and the concealment disappears. As nicht nur seinen sie nicht mehr chas v'shalom midim von avodas Hashem, which means not only do these obstacles not interfere with us serving the Eibishter chas v'shalom, no adarab is a very nefach zu Messiah. They actually are transformed into our assistance. They helfen arisiten in alles was nötigen sich. All the things in the world that previously were our impediments become our assistance. In an ofen as the in Eretz Mitzrayim, like the Jews in Mitzrayim who already had light at a time of darkness, in spite of all of the boundaries that they lived with in Mitzrayim, and das wird der Achana Krevitzum Kimayud from the world coming on board and assisting us to serve the Eibishter properly, paves the way for the prophecy about the time of Mashiach, where foreigners will be the ones looking after our needs and our flocks, etc. Which will happen with Mashiach, who should come immediately.